I'm just going to take the liberty of walking through a little devotion with Psalm 139, just because of the number of people who are making decisions and going through times of testing. It's my favorite passage to commend to people as they're going through a time of especially testing. What I'd like to do is to read it alternatively. Well, we can't do that because you've got different versions. Okay, so we won't do that. The Psalms are typically, written with parallelism as the form of their poetry. So they're either saying one thing and then restating another set of words, they're saying something and they're saying just the opposite in the next line, and sometimes there's a synthetic kind of parallelism that builds on each part of the verse. So one of the reasons I love this psalm as somebody's going through a time of testing is it starts with an affirmation of God's presence in somebody's life, and how well God knows us. So to get that part in front of us, that's actually verses 1 to 12. Does somebody want to start reading with verse 1?
O Lord, you have searched me, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you.
Thanks, Andy. So in the introductory section, what he's just doing is celebrating the fact that God is always attentive to his place in life. And there are some people who say, well, how could God know all of us that intimately? Well, he's God, right? He has that capacity, and what David is celebrating here is that God is always knowing what's going on in his life, and even when he doesn't feel it. And the analogy I like to use for that is if the kids are all playing in the backyard and mom and dad are doing the dishes, usually there's a window over the sink. For some reason, that's where they put a window. And so, that parent can be watching those children, but they don't feel it. They don't know it. They might be constantly checking to see if everything's okay, especially if somebody lets out a yelp, right? Then you kind of give it a little extra attention, but the kids may never know that you are seeing, and sometimes, of course, that's a bad thing for them, because then you see them doing something wrong, like hitting a brother or sister, and you can call them out on it, and they thought that nobody was watching. So it's that celebration of God's presence, and verse 4 I always like to pause on, because that's both comforting and scary. It's scary because if God knows what's on your tongue before you know it, that means he knows all the bad things that go on in your brain, go on in and come out of your mouth, right? But it's also comforting, because the way I always put it with confession is you can't ever, one of the reasons we're uneasy about confessing sin to another human being is we're not sure how they're going to handle it. And what if they knew? Whereas you can't tell God anything he doesn't already know. That's the point, right? So when we're confessing to God, we can be brutally honest because we know that there's nothing that we're going to tell him that he's going to be surprised at, right? And so, like I say, it can be scary, but it also can be a great comfort. That next verse just reminds me of, if you've ever seen St. Patrick's breastplate thing, you know, Christ above me, Christ below me, Christ behind me, Christ in front of me, Christ beside me. It just reminds me of that. It maybe had been the inspiration for St. Patrick. And then to realize that there's no place I can go, that's where it goes. Now, not only do you know what's inside of me, not only are you beside me as I go through life, but there's no place I can go on the face of this earth or in this universe where you're not going to be there because you fill all things. So if I go to the heavens, if I go to the depths, if I go on the far side of the sea. And he talks about his hand and his right hand, which are sometimes images of the Messiah in the Old Testament. So it's an interesting phrase. And then about 11 and 12, I always say God's even got night vision goggles. Right? Even the darkness is not dark to you. Okay? So it's that confidence that God is completely interested and attuned with what's going on in the psalmist's life. The next section is verses 13 to 16. Somebody want to read those 4 verses for us?
For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearful and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame is not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be.
Okay, and so in this section he says, you were there at my beginning, and you already know about my end. So he's looking over his whole life and saying, God, I recognize that you were there and knew me in my mother's womb. I always like to say it this way to women who are pregnant. God knew you were pregnant before you did. Right? You knit me together in my mother's womb. And all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. It's the amazing truth about God's knowledge. And somebody will say, well, does that mean that God wills the day of my death? And the answer is no, not necessarily.
He just knows what it is.
He just knows what it is. He knows what's going to happen. He knows how it's going to happen. But that doesn't mean that he wills it to happen in that particular way. You know, whether it's somebody like Cindy and Jeff being, if their lives would have been lost in that. Would God have wanted that fellow to clip their car? And well, obviously not. But would he know in his divine providence that that was going to happen? Yeah. And so he sees the consequences of evil around us. The next 2 verses are a couplet. Somebody want to read those 2, 17 and 18?
How precious to me are thy thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee.
So how precious, and it's just talking about how God knows so much more than we do. One author illustrated it this way: one of the problems we have when we pray is we pray within a context. And if you think about this whiteboard as being the total knowledge that God has, how much do we know? Maybe that much. And when we're asking and praying and discerning what God's will is, we're doing it from that position. He can see the whole board. He can see everything. And that's why we commit ourselves to God and trust that He's going to answer the prayers from His perspective in His time and His way. And that's where David is. Now comes a really challenging section. It's verses 19 to 22.
If only you would slay the wicked, O God. Away from me, you bloodthirsty men. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and abhor those who rise up against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies.
So I love the things that you love, God, and I hate the things that you hate. And there is a, as Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, a time to love and a time to hate. In Romans chapter 12, he says, hate evil and cling to what is good. And so he's just saying, we don't know what enemies he might be talking about in his life at this particular time, but his adversaries are also, it says, your adversaries. And it says, they speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. They might have been false prophets. Don't know. What we do know is that they were not people who God was enamored with, and therefore David is not enamored with them any. And then for the testing image, I love verses 20 and 24. 23 and 24. Somebody read those two? 23 and 24.
Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way of the everlasting.
So here's where he invites God to examine him and to see something that is wrong that he can't see himself. So Sandy's sister is going to go through this MRI. What's the purpose? To see something that you can't see with the naked eye, and to see something that you often can't feel. Okay? So why do we go through regular checkups and get blood draws? You know, you can have high blood pressure, but if it's not all that high and it's not causing any problem, you're not going to know it unless somebody slaps a blood pressure cuff around you. You're not going to know if your blood is in balance or whether you've got diabetes or you're pre-diabetic unless somebody's testing your sugar. And so often there are things that can be wrong with us that we don't know because there's no symptoms. So I like this in a kind of a physical testing setting because you're asking the doctor to do physically what David's asking God to do spiritually. Right? Check me out, because you can see stuff that I can't see. And you're going to use the test in order to do it. And David can say this because he says, see if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. He says, God, if there's something that you see, help me become aware of it and deal with it in my own life. And I think it's just a wonderful prayer before you're going through testing. And especially in this context where he's already affirmed, God, you know me inside and out. God, you've been with me since the very beginning. You created my life, and you're going to be with me at the very end. You already know how it's going to be. And I know that you see the big picture, and I only see a little bitty dot. Sometimes I can't even see who my enemies are, right? And so God's got to make you aware of that. But then this prayer, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So I just thought I'd take just a few minutes to kind of walk through that psalm because it's one of my favorites, especially when somebody's getting ready for testing, to encourage their heart as they lay their prayers before God about that testing. All right. Well then, anybody else got any reflections on that psalm? Something else that sparked thinking as we were walking through it? I hadn't planned on that today, but it just seemed appropriate with some of the testing and decision making and all that kind of stuff. All right, I'd like you to read Joshua 24 while I take a quick break. and we'll get into this text. It's a very some of the words are very familiar, especially in the middle, starting with verse 14. Would you read that together, please? Then Joshua
assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord, to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents out of Egypt, from that land of slavery, and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites, who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord, because he is our God."
Okay. First question is, when has someone older than you given you advice? And as someone was getting ready to die, what have they ever made sure to tell you? What have they ever made sure to tell you? That's where Joshua is right now. He's getting ready to die. He's leaving the leadership position he's had among the Israelites, and so these are his last words. And he's giving them some advice and he's calling them here. So, anybody have something they want to share about somebody who spoke to them?
What if we didn't listen?
What if we didn't listen? Well, it's just realizing that people, when they're at the end of life, they don't waste a lot of words. Sometimes because they don't have the energy, but also because they know they don't have the time.
But also, it isn't always specifically in words and conversations. You know, something we found with Gene, he had travel on his mind. He was going to go to Appleton. He was going to Sheboygan. He was going to Appleton. His older sister Joyce had lived there all her life. She'd been gone for a couple of years.
Yeah.
But he was going to see her.
He was going to see her.
You know, and the pointing over the end of the bed, he's seeing somebody there. So they talk to you in different ways.
Yeah.
There is a wonderful book called Final Gifts. The fact that the person who is dying is giving you their last gifts, and you should be aware of that this isn't mere ramblings. This just isn't dementia. This isn't just something. This is something that
Caused by the drugs or whatever they're.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a final gift to you. Wish I had caught that sooner, but it was given to me in hospice, up at the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a different type of talking.
Talking. And sometimes it's not just talking. Sometimes it's an action.
Yeah.
Bill would always stir when I came in the room and talked to him, even though he didn't talk back to me.
Yeah.
You know, or girls would say, yeah, he always had that little smile on his
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. We remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes people are cognizant in ways that we don't always understand of our presence as well. I've used this on the other end of life with parents who have, especially moms who have had preemies and they're going to the hospital every day to the NICU unit. And one of the things I read someplace is, that the sound of their mom's voice, and dad's voice, if he's been involved in the pregnancy, the kids are used to from just the time of gestation. And as they develop hearing in the womb, they're able to recognize that. I know studies have been done that they can recognize both their mother and father's voices right after birth. They'll have a bunch of men there speak, and they'll turn toward their father's voice. Actually, one OB/GYN nurse told me one time, yeah, well, Pastor, they hear the father better than they do the mother. And I said, how come? And she said, because the mother's voice travels through her bones and flesh. Because the baby's not just hearing, like if the father speaks, she said it's going through, yes, her belly, but then the amniotic fluid, and water is a great conductor of sound. Think about how whales communicate and all that kind of stuff, right? But a mom's voice comes through.
Yeah, it's kind of like we don't recognize our own voice when we hear it on a recording, because it
Right.
sounds different
To
when you
us.
hear it to us, right?
Because we're hearing it through
Through our bodies and their, instead of with our ears.
So it just, so I always tell them, well, then you should just, even though the kids can't always hold them, what are you going to do all the time? Just read out loud, because they hear your voice. I remember one mom, her child was about 2 months premature, so she was 6 weeks, I think, in the hospital before she was able to bring that little one home. And one time I walked in there and she was reading out loud a Stephen King novel.
Bad choice.
Well, no, I said, that's an interesting choice. And she said, Pastor, she said, I've wanted to read this. I haven't had time to read it. And so she said, and the nurses tell me that when I come in and start reading, they can tell on the monitor that the baby knows I'm here.
Yeah.
Because the heart rate will change. And she said it doesn't matter whether I'm reading the newspaper or whether I'm reading, the comics in the newspaper or whether I'm reading a book. And it doesn't matter what book I read. It doesn't matter what.
Yeah.
It's just hearing the sound of this familiar voice was really, really helpful. Yeah. Okay, let's skim Joshua 23, and then we'll read a little bit more of Joshua 24. So I just want you to track with me. It says, after a long time had passed and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies. Doesn't tell us how long of time this is. It just tells us that people that's kind of settled in the land in their particular areas, as the land was divvied up among the 12 tribes. And it says Joshua by then was old and well advanced in years. And he now he summons all Israel. Now when it says all Israel, it means specifically, and he records that they're elders, they're leaders, they're judges and officials. So all of the kind of leaders of the people of Israel are meant by all Israel. Obviously not every man, woman, and child showed up. And what does he do? Well, he says, I'm old and advanced in years, like he had to tell them that, but he does. And what he's saying is, I'm getting ready. You've seen what God has done. He allotted the inheritance for your tribes, and the Lord's driven out all your enemies. Now he says in verse 6, be very strong, be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or left. Don't associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of your gods or swear by them. You must not serve or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now. This has always been the danger for the people of Israel as they went into the land of Palestine, is that they would start worshiping some of the other gods that were around. He recalls, again, God's power in driving out the nations in verses 9 to 11. And he invites them in verse 11, saying, so be very careful to love the Lord your God. And then he gives them a warning. But if you desert him, then, verse 13, the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you. Whips on your back. In other words, you'll serve somebody else, thorns in your eyes, until you perish this land. And now he's very blunt about his death. Now I'm about to go the way of all the earth. In other words, everything dies. I remember reading this not that long ago. It never occurred to me, but it was somebody who was dying who said, it was somebody from a Christian background, who said, I'm leaving the land of the dying so that I can go to the land of the living. And I never thought about that before, but, we're in the land of the dying. Those who have died and been transferred into the presence of God are in the land of the living. And so he says, I'm going to go the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul, not one of all the good promises of the Lord your God has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. And then again, the threat. So there's this constant interplay between God has blessed you. Now don't do anything that is evil, because there will be a consequence. And remember that in the Old Testament, we've talked about these two covenants that exist side by side. One is a one-sided covenant and the other is a two-sided covenant. And the one-sided covenant goes back to the Garden of Eden, when God said, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. You will crush your head and you will bruise his heel, he says to Satan. And that's a one-sided promise. Remember, Adam and Eve never said, I'm sorry. Before they spoke, after the first person that God speaks to is Satan, and he says, this is going to happen. He reiterates that covenant again and again in the Old Testament, especially to Abraham. And he makes that promise that in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And that has been passed down now through the line, then Abraham to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and Jacob to Judah, so that the coming Messiah is going to be a descendant of the line of Judah. It's going to be reiterated after this to David. You're not going to build a kingdom for me, I'm going to build a kingdom for you. And the one who takes your throne will be a king forever. And that messianic promise is repeated again and again in the Old Testament. But at Sinai, so this one begins back in Eden, but at Sinai, God starts this two-sided covenant, which is, I'm going to rescue you, I'm going to bring you into the land, and as long as you obey me, you will have my protection. But if you chase after other gods, if you trust other gods, well, you're going to find out how well you should have trusted them by what's going to happen to you, because there will be consequences. So this is a two-sided covenant, and both of those run concurrently. And here he's calling them to a two-sided covenant. And one of the things that's true, even as God deals with the two-sided covenant, and it's just a dynamic you see working out here in our discipleship model. We use this, let's see what I want to do. Let's do invitation here and challenge. So the up and down axis is invitation. This is challenge. And what you see very often in the scriptures is a interplay between both invitation and challenge. Right? So a very simple one would be something like this. Jesus says, come follow me, invitation. and I will make you fishers of men. There's the challenge. You know, it's not just follow me and we're going to sit around and drink tea and have a good time. And what happens if this is high, and this is high, and this is low, and this is low? One of the ways you can think about that is somebody who's high invitation and low challenge. This is really comfortable. Because you're always welcoming me and you never challenge me. Okay? Some people call this cozy. But comfortable, cozy. If it's low invitation and high challenge, what would that be?
That's deadly.
That's in your face.
Yeah.
Right?
Uncomfortable.
Yeah, this one is kind of domineering. It's the when I say jump, you say how high.
On the other side of that one?
Right? Huh?
Other side of that one?
High challenge. Oh no, yeah. Oh no, this should be low. I'm sorry.
Right.
That's over here. So this would be the domineering one over here.
Yeah.
Okay, low challenge and low.
Boring.
Absolutely, that's what they call it. This is where you get bored and disconnected, because if I don't have a lot of invitation, why should I even have a relationship with you?
Right.
And of course, this is where you want to be. With a high invitation, I know that you love me, and a high challenge, I want you to be the best you can be. You know, and this is what Jesus calls us into, is this particular quadrant, and it's really what Josh was doing here. He's got high invitation. Look at all that God has done for you. He loves you. He cares for you. He's promised to be with you. Now don't screw up. Follow him. Listen to him. Don't follow other gods. All right? So it's high invitation, high challenge. And this is where discipleship happens, is in that high challenge, high invitation quadrant. Okay. Let's take a look then at chapter 24. I kind of jumped over that one, went to the next question about a combination of invitation and challenge. And here's the text that you read. You notice that what they cut out, though, is a lot of the invitation and challenge. And I'll read through that just because of the names that are there, starting with 2a, which is the first part of A just says, this is what the Lord your God Israel says, and then they cut, 7 verses. Well, they cut 13 verses out. So what are those 13 verses? Long ago your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, that lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the river and led him throughout Canaan, and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. And I assigned the hill country of Seir to Esau, but Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out. And when I brought your fathers out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea. But they cried to the Lord for help, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians. He brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians. Then you lived in the desert for a long time. I brought you to the land of 40 years, we know. I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hands. I destroyed them from before you when you took possession of their land. When Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, prepared to fight against Israel, he sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to put a curse on you. That's the story of Balaam's ass, the talking donkey, where he had been instructed to go curse him. And then the angel of the Lord got in the way, and the donkey kept bucking around. And finally the donkey talks. And so instead of cursing the Israelites, he ended up blessing them. But I would not listen to Balaam, so he blessed you again and again, and I delivered you out of his hand. Then you crossed the Jordan, came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, but I gave them into your hands. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you. Also the 2 Amorite kings. You did not do it with your own sword and bow, so I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. That's what's missing. Right? Huh? Yeah, he's just recounted everything from Abraham until this day. It's his shorthand account of how God had been with them. Now I want you to think about Romans chapter 12 we've been focusing on. Remember that first phrase. But now in view of God's mercy. And this is the same thing. The challenge comes, but always in view of the mercy, of the invitation, of the relationship that God has called us into. And that's exactly where he starts. Even the 10 Commandments, remember, were given that way. If you remember, and we never have to, we memorize the commandments by commandment. So don't have any other gods besides me, first commandment. But what comes before that? God begins it in Exodus chapter 20 with these words, I, the Lord your God, have called you out of Egypt. Therefore, it's in view of the mercy. And remember, even in that context, just historically, Moses is at Sinai for the burning bush. He gets the call to go into Egypt, and God doesn't give him the 10 Commandments there and say, take it to them, challenge them. And if they do what I ask them to do, then I'll invite them to live with me. No, he invites them to live with him, and now he says, because of my great love and view of my mercy, here's how you should live. So that's what's missing in the Old Testament lesson today is this context. And just kind of reflecting on those words, the next question is, as you have journeyed through life, can you see special times when your relationship with God made a difference? When he was in charge. When he blessed you in ways that you couldn't imagine. You know, and I see all kinds of things that have been at work in my life, I think about. You know, I moved a lot when I was a kid. And had not Martin Luther High School opened up on the south side, my dad would never have come back, and I'd never met my wife. And the oldest child whose birthday I celebrate today would never have been, you know. And then, and then through again, a lot of things just kind of fell into place. So then we got married young, yes, because we've been dating 5 years by that time. And so, yes, we're halfway through college. Well, I couldn't play football anymore because you can't put food on the table playing college football, especially in the kind of league we're in. It's not like there was, we weren't in a Division I, not with my stature. You know, I'd have to be a lot bigger, right? So I got a job. I got a job working minimum wage in a meatpacking plant, nailing pallets together, you know. And I think I made $2.35 an hour or something like that at that particular time. I worked usually from about 4 to 11 every night. So that was my life, you know. I saw my wife only on weekends, usually Saturday and Sunday, because she worked a different shift after school. She worked in a bank. And we'd drive to school together. We'd usually eat lunch together, so we'd see each other during the day, but once in a while we'd have a class together. But because of just that was a job on the job board at Concordia River Forest, and I called and I got the job, and so then I got married, and the president of the company found out I got married and decided that, well, this young guy who's studying to be a preacher might be a good babysitter for my kids when my wife and I want to go away on a conference or on a vacation. And he was a good Catholic, so he had 5 kids, and the youngest one was a baby. And so house sitting and babysitting. But in that process, he got to know us, and we got to know him. And then when he asked me, what are you doing after? I said, well, I'm either going to St. Louis to the seminary or Fort Wayne. He said, well, if you go to Fort Wayne, I'll guarantee you a job, because Peter Eckrich and Sons, which is the Oscar Mayer of that part of the world, their main office and production plant is in Fort Wayne, and the company I was working for had been bought by Peter Eckrich and Sons, so was a subsidiary, so he knew all the bigwigs at Peter Eckrich and Sons, and he said, if you go there, I'll guarantee you a job. So I ended up going to Fort Wayne, not because I said this was a better seminary, it's just because I needed to put food on the table, and I had an opportunity to do that. It didn't matter where I went. And so we go to Fort Wayne, and we experience, that was a union job. I only worked to start one night a week, but I would make more in that one night because everything after midnight was time and a half. So I made like $7.50 an hour there. And then, so everything after midnight was over $10 an hour. Well, I could work that one night a week and make more than a lot of my classmates were making at minimum wage at some of the other jobs that they had. And then that ended up being, I ended up working a little bit more for them. I was able to work for them for the 2 years that I was there for my first two years, and then set up another student with that job. And when I came back from Vicarage, I had that job, when I came back. And then I would work vacations, so I would get a 40-hour week sometimes. I'd work from, 8 at night until sometimes 4 or 5 in the morning, go home, sleep a couple of hours, and then go to my classes. But you could do that for a week or two, and survive. But all of that meant I didn't have any debt when I came out of school. None. Which is not true of most people who become pastors today. And then I went on a vicarage during seminary, and long story short, it was horrific. It was a guy who was just kind of crazy as a pastor. One time he was preaching on Ephesians, put on the full armor of God. He put a helmet on his head, and he said, "This is what I should have had when I took the call to this place." So, my first staff meeting, he decided not to show up, and all the teachers were going to hand in their resignation and not come in the next day. It was kind of a troubled place, and you're kind of looking up to heaven and say, "Okay, God, what's going on here?" We already had Jesse, and Jerry was pregnant with Josh when we got to that place, and finally then the seminary said, "Well, we're going to pull you." 6 months in, they said, "You might have to do the whole year over again." But 2 weeks later, I get a call from South Dakota saying, "How'd you like to come to Winter, South Dakota?" Some guy who had been asking for a vicar for like 3 years. He had a triple parish, and he had a dual parish vacancy, so he was taking care of 5 congregations. West River, which means it's ranching country, and so we packed up. Jerry's 8 months pregnant. We moved to South Dakota, which is why Josh was a cowboy. He just doesn't know it because we left there when he was 6 months old. And you just start looking back on it, and sure, there were times when you looked up to heaven and said, "What in the world are you doing, God?" But then you start to see how the pieces fall in place. And it's that kind of thing that I think that this kind of text highlights for you and for me, is making it personal. What does it look like in your life? Yeah, Margie.
It's like I've said before, and I can't resist saying it again, I've gotten everything I wanted and not the way I thought I should get it. Every single time I tried to do something where I thought I should go, God blocked the way. He opened up doors that I didn't want to go through. I went through them, but then there are other things he wouldn't let me do.
Yep.
But I got everything I wanted in the end, but I didn't know that's the way I had to go.
Right. Yeah, there's just so many things. My first call was back to Wisconsin. That there were only a couple of calls that were back to Wisconsin. We actually had a classmate of ours who came up to Jerry and said that was going to be my call to Auroraville and Trinity Borth and Emmanuel Auroraville. And, you know, and then we were there, and then we were in North Fond du Lac, and then I get called here the first time, and I could never understand it because the most I'd ever had was a part-time secretary who worked 1 day a week. And then I got called to be the senior pastor here, overseeing a school and right? And they told me as soon as I accepted the call, oh, by the way, we want to start a building project. And I said, well, you're going to have to wait a year because we need to establish some relationships and that kind of thing. So we did, you know, we built it I came in 1990, we built it in 1992. But all those things, you know, you just, and even coming back here, you know, the way that whole started is I had conversations with Ridge because I baptized his grandbaby, Collins, over at Emmanuel in October, and he said, we might need some help. Would you help out once you retire? And I said, yeah, sure. And then 3 declinations of calls later, the conversation changed, you know. And now it wasn't just help with the vacancy, can you come back and pastor us for a little bit? And, you know, you just start to see how, you know, God kind of moves things around in your life in ways that you couldn't have imagined. So and sometimes it's hard when you're looking up to heaven saying, God, what in the world are you doing with me now? It is really hard when you're going through that valley. But what we do know is what he says in Psalm 139, what he says in Psalm 23. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And I know you're walking with me through it. I can't see what's at the other side of this valley, but I know you're walking with me through it. And so I think that's one of the ways that you and I can make this text very, very, very personal is if we reflect on how the relationship with God has made a difference in our lives. Or I can think of all the times that people have said to me, I don't know what it would be like to go through this, whatever it was, without faith. I don't know what it would be like. I can't imagine what it would be like not to have the knowledge that I've got a God who loves me, who forgives me, and who has promised that he has good for me. So then in the text, he warns them about worshiping other gods. What are the gods in our culture we are tempted to worship and follow?
Career and money.
Career, right?
I think
Money.
self-worth right now, that whole idea of look in the mirror and say how wonderful you are. And
Participation trophies.
What? Yeah.
Aren't you?
Well, I mean, you know what I mean? You see these things like, well, there's one ad that just drives me nuts. It's the one on Botox now there's a couple of one for migraines and then the other one to get rid of wrinkles.
Yeah.
The one on to get rid of the wrinkles, the woman looks at herself in the mirror. It's like, oh, don't I look good? And I'm going, oh, you know what I mean? It's worship of self, I would call it.
Yeah. When you think about the amount of money that goes into the industries that have to do with how we look.
It's that Sono Bella. So I look at that all the time on television, you know, we'll just peel off this fat here. And I'm saying, what is that worth in a coffin after I'm gone? I could have used that money and given it to my kids for school.
Sure.
So what you have to do is weigh out the value.
Well, it's about your priorities and your values. And I think I've referenced this before. Tim Keller is one that I think is really good on this. He talks about the idols of our age and about our own personal idols. And one of the ways he said you can get at your personal idol is to ask, what does not take any effort for me to spend money on? And then he uses, for me it's books, which every time I use this example, Jerry, if she's here, she's trying to catch up from all the stuff she couldn't do in the last couple days, and that's why she's not here today. But she always says, Dan, that's your idol. You know? I mean, I've never had any trouble spending money on books. I have to refrain from spending money on books. I just love to read.
For my husband's, it's cooking appliances.
Cooking appliances.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
If you can
whatever.
find a drawer for it, you can have it, but
Yeah,
the drawer's
whatever
locked.
you find no effort at all in spending money on, it's just easy, is probably the idols of your own heart. And of course, idols in our culture are things like beauty and intelligence and money, power. You know, why do some of these politicians want to be where they're at? They don't need the money. Why would somebody 80 years old want to still be
Yeah.
president or want to be
Speaker of the House.
Speaker of the House or a Supreme Court justice? You know, why? What is it about that position? And sometimes it's because that's their identity as well. If they quit being that, they don't know who they are.
Right.
You know, and that becomes all wrapped up in that. Sometimes it's the kind of house you live in, the neighborhood you live in, all of that kind of stuff can be very, very, the kind of car you drive. Some people put a lot of money into the kind of car they drive, primarily because it's what they can spend, it's what they spend their money easily on. And so, you know, it's those kind of things. So just thinking about that a little bit and what gods are a problem in our culture, and I think that's one way to get at the gods in our own hearts. And then he talks about, now this is after our text, so let's go back, verse 18. Let's start with verse 19. The other thing it does is it doesn't tell you the rest of the story. Of course, we're not going to read these 2 chapters in which where you'll all be going, rolling your eyes saying, come on. Right? So I'm just going to run through those real quick. Joshua said to the people, you're not able to serve the Lord. He's a holy God. He's a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he'll turn and bring disaster on you, make an end of you after he has been good to you. But the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said, you are witnesses against yourselves that you've chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. Now then, said Joshua, throw away the foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him. And on that day Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem he drew up for them decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. And then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. See, he said to all the people, this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words that the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you're untrue to your God. And the question I have is, what markers or symbols of commitment could we use to identify our commitments and our commitment to Jesus?
You mean like wearing a cross or
Yeah.
something? Okay.
It'd be like wearing a cross, right? And when you walk into some place, you assume that somebody who's wearing a cross is probably a Christian. Some people put the little fish symbol on the back of their car or something else like that. What are some of the other markers? Well, T-shirts that have been printed, right? I have one that's that I wear on the 4th of July that speaks about God and his love for us and all that kind of stuff.
I have one
Red,
that,
white, and blue.
I don't remember if we got it here at St. John's or if I got it from my parents' church, where during Lent, it's a cross, it's a plastic cross that we stick in our yard, and all through Lent it just faces out toward the road, and on Easter morning you turn it around and it says he's risen on the back side. And of course, one year I put it up and my neighbor got all freaked out because our dog was in a bad time, and he's like, did she die? And I'm like, no, the other side of the cross. But I didn't bury her under my maple tree. But
Well, you're making me think when you said maple tree, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, you know? It's those kind of things, markers. We get married, most people get wedding rings, which are supposed to be markers of the commitment that one person makes to the other. Just went through that this weekend because I had the wedding. Receive this ring as a pledge and sign of my love and faithfulness. You know, it's a marker.
in this day and age, there's a lot of tattoos too.
There's a lot of tattoos that people use as markers. Yeah, when I first met my son-in-law, he's got a tattoo. He and his friend got, they went out when they were teens together, and it's on his calf, and it's a fish symbol with a little cross in it. But other people get other kind of markers. My son in North Carolina got one that has their wedding date on it.
Nice.
You know, I've got another nephew. He's got the footprint and the birth date of all 3 of his kids on his arms.
Wow, that's cool. Can't forget that.
You know, yeah. So we use all kinds of markers that way to mark commitments or truths in our lives, and just thinking about those kind of things. The next question is just, have you ever considered writing a letter or sharing a testimony after your death? And I was going to show this YouTube video, but we don't have internet. Didn't have it yesterday, don't have it today. We're trying to rectify that. That's why I was coming in when some of you were coming in, because I do have internet at home, so I was able to do some emailing and stuff like that and looking up a few things there. But I encourage you to play this one. It's a country western one, and it's I think it's entitled, If You're Reading This, Tim McGraw. And it's written from the perspective of a soldier who's died. You know, and he says, if you're reading this, then you know I got a one-way ticket over here. And so it's a song that's written from the perspective of somebody who's died. One of the reasons I encourage sometimes people to do this is because it can become a great comfort to the family. I had a fella at Emmanuel Brookfield whose mom was kind of crusty and sometimes kind of coarse. And he always kind of wondered about her faith, but after she died, he went through some of the papers that she had, and she had not one, but 2 different testimonies to her faith. And I have a copy of them in my file, because when I encourage somebody to do something like this, it's one of the things I'll give to them and say, here's the kind of thing. And what a comfort it was to know where her heart was. Some people have, if they've done a Christian will, have incorporated some kind of testimony in the will itself in the preamble as a part of it, so that when the kids are hearing the will read, or whatever people in your life who would be the ones inheriting, that they would see a witness to your faith there. Yeah, Margie?
What Den did, because while he was in hospice in November, he went and he bought Christmas gifts for all the grandkids. So on Christmas, they opened up packages that had crosses and all kinds of stuff. And the other day I saw Abby had the cross on, and I said, that's from Grandpa, isn't it? She said, yep. So it's kind of a nice thing.
Yeah, I had a gal at, and actually she was one of the people who had our grief share, but her daughter died of cancer in her 30s, and she had one daughter who was maybe around 7 at the time that she died. You know, so it was kind of tough for a mom to leave her daughter at that age. But what she did is she wrote a birthday card for, I don't know how many years it covers, but then she gave it to her mom to give to friends who would mail it to her, so it got there on her birthday.
Nice.
And so I know she was still receiving them, and it had been like 15 years. She was still receiving those cards each year from her mom saying happy birthday.
Wow.
Yeah. Can you imagine the kind of both tears and comfort that would bring? You know, I've had people do that with, I remember my first congregation, I had a crusty old lady, Hilda, who had a child, died in a farm accident, adopted another one, but she was a little bit older, so her grandkids were, you know, going through, the 2 oldest ones were going through confirmation when I was there, And she knew she probably wouldn't live to see the two youngest ones go through confirmation, but she bought them all confirmation gifts. She also bought them all wedding gifts. Should they get married, that her son and his wife would have a gift from grandma that was, and then she'd write a card, you know. And it's just, again, one of those opportunities to touch somebody's life even after you're gone. And so thinking about that and saying those things that you'd like to have said. I can remember Lester Nelk. When I was here in Lester, you remember, had pancreatic cancer. I think he was diagnosed and he was gone in about 18 months, something like that. But Lester was a deep man of faith, and so he pretty much wrote the funeral service for me. But he also wrote things that he said, I want you to say this. And when I visit him, he'd say, I want you to say this. And he wrote a little something out that he wrote for all 5 of his boys, that he wanted me to say at the funeral, in the sermon. And it was about being faithful to God and trusting God in spite of having lost their dad at such a young age. And you got to believe that words like that have a significant impact on the hearers. So it's just thinking a little bit about how you can speak into the lives of people that you love and care for, even after you're gone. And so I encourage you to, if you haven't seen that, see it for the first time. If not, revisit it. And we'll, I guess, close with this. What might you commit to do in light of this passage? For example, share with someone close what God has done for you and your family. Someone that's close to you. That'd be like he does in 2-13. Identify one concrete spiritual commitment you want to make. Write down on paper the God you wish to forsake, or make a marker to remind you of your commitment to love and serve Jesus. So it's a way to kind of put into practice what we see evidenced in this particular lesson. Anybody want to add anything as we're closing here? Thoughts? Experiences you've had?
Several times at St. John's, we went through I believe it was a St. Louis program called The Gospel According to You. And it was a Friday night and all day Saturday session.
Mm-hmm.
It involved the pastor and involved small groups where you discuss things, and you ended up at the end with either the outline for what you wanted to say to someone or a letter that you wanted to send to them. And it was, I mean, I went through it 5 times because I thought it was such a wonderful experience. I first went to it in Madison, but then Pastor Wayman was willing to have it here.
Yeah.
And I know Marcy and Dick went through it, and I mean, it just was a very positive experience. You ended up with this opportunity to talk to somebody, knowing, you know, the passages you wanted to
Right.
talk
Yeah.
about, you knew.
That's always the
Yeah,
challenge.
it was really worthwhile.
Yeah, to really have thought that through, and not that you would use everything with every person that you would have that sharing with, but then you're prepared.
No, but you were thinking of one specific person when you did
When you were
this,
doing this?
yeah. But, I mean, obviously you could adapt it if you wanted to.
So just an encouragement to think of ways that you can give testimony to the blessings in your heart, and an encouragement to look back on all the mercies that God has poured into your life. And never to be in a situation where you feel like God is driving you, but to understand that God first gives you grace, and in view of his mercies then says, now here's how you can live differently as one of my children in the world as you're making your way through it. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you for these words of Joshua to the people as he was preparing to die. We know that he was leaving that place in leadership where you had given him, and you used him to remind them of your incredible mercy in their lives. And in so doing, invited them to stay in that relationship which you created by your call, by your invitation. And then you challenged them to set aside the gods that would so easily lead their hearts away from you. And we just ask that you would do the same for us. Whatever it is that is our God, that you would lead us to leave it by the wayside, to cling to you alone as our Lord and as our Savior. To trust you in those times when we're looking up at heaven saying, God, I don't know what you're doing in my life right now, but trusting your love and grace because we see the fullness of it in the face of your Son, our Savior, Jesus, who gave his all so that we might be yours, that our sins might be forgiven, that our identity and our future might be secure. We commit all this into your good and gracious hands for his name's sake. Amen. Well, have a good week.
Thank you. Yeah, and have fun at your thing.
Day of the Light.
Whatever you call it on Saturday.